Hi, I'm Krista, and this is Krista Reads and Writes. And first, I want to start by saying this video, once again, is more than a week after the last one. I swear I am doing everything to get onto this once a week schedule I want to do. All I can say at this point is I will do my best. I do have a couple of other big projects going on, and I do have a full-time job. So, but what I'm doing for this channel, I love it. So I want to keep doing it. It's enjoyable to me. So I will keep doing it. And I will just keep working on the frequency, or I'll tweak the frequency at some point. But I want to talk about the progress I made on the goals I made in my last video, which the first one was to finish this, The Hand of the Baskervilles, and I did that. It's the first Sherlock Holmes mystery that I have read, and I enjoyed it a lot. I've watched a lot of Sherlock Holmes mysteries, but it's the first one I've read. So what I tend to do is buy paperbacks and then see if I like them. And then if I do, then I'll invest in a hardback. And I've definitely enjoyed this one enough to invest in a hardback at some point, and probably read some more Sherlock Holmes at some point. My second goal was to continue my research on Franz Kafka and the Metamorphosis, and I did that. I spent most of my week and a half doing that. And I've still got a long way to go, but the more I get into it, the more fascinating it is. The more I study this story, the more I like it. There is so much, so many different ways to look at it. I'm really having a good time with that. And then the third one I did not make, which was to at least start on my next article based on what I learned about Mary from the book Jesus and the Jewish Roots of Mary. This is a fascinating book, I think, by Brent Petre. I'm guessing it how to say his last name. This is a really good book, and I've got tons to write and say about it. So that's how I did on my goals this week. So I would say I'm at 2 out of 3. I want to spend the rest of the time talking about Franz Kafka and the Metamorphosis. And like I said already, there's so many ways to look at this story, and there's so much to learn and so much to read. I actually started a couple of articles that will appear on my website, indulgingmycuriosities.com, at some point, but I haven't finished them. But I think what I want to do today is talk about something more in depth that I talked about in, I think it was the last video, which is the fact that I think that the Metamorphosis refers to more than just Gregor Samsa's physical transformation. I think it refers to his internal transformation. I think it refers to his father goes through a transformation, his sister goes through a transformation, his mother goes through a transformation, and the family as a unit goes through a transformation. So I don't, I think that most people's first thought is that the Metamorphosis refers to Gregor finding himself transformed into a monstrous vermin in his bed one morning. And while that is definitely a metamorphosis, I think there's a lot more of those going on in this story than just that one obvious one. So let's see where to start. And as I go through this too, I have started learning some things about Franz Kafka that are, I think, very clearly reflected in this story. The first one that I have mentioned before is that he had a really difficult relationship with his father. I learned a little about his father this week. His name was Hermann Kafka. There have been a few authors who have written biographies about Kafka. One of them is Stanley Korngold. And in his biography, he described Hermann Kafka as, quote, a huge, selfish, overbearing businessman. And maybe not the businessman part, but huge, selfish, and overbearing, I think definitely apply to Gregor Samsa's father in the Metamorphosis. His father also was a traveling salesman, which is Gregor's occupation in the story. So as far as his metamorphosis, in the beginning of the story, the family as a whole has come to rely on Gregor's income to support them completely. None of them work. They all stay home and he covers their bills. He covers all the household expenses. There's a passage that in my book starts on page 25 and goes to page 26 that explains Gregor getting his job, when he first got his job, and what life at home had been like then and what it had become. So it starts on page 25. And it goes like this. In those days, Gregor's sole concern had been to do everything in his power to make the family forget as quickly as possible the business disaster, which had plunged everyone into a state of total despair. So let me pause there for a second. He is working at a job that he hates and plans to continue doing so. I think at some point he says for probably 5 or 6 more years to pay off a debt that his family owes. And because it's his understanding that his family had a business that failed, and somehow in the midst of that, they ended up in debt to the person who's now his manager. And so he had begun to work with special ardor and had risen almost overnight from stock clerk to traveling salesman, which of course had opened up very different money-making possibilities. And in no time, his successes on the job were transformed by means of commissions into hard cash that could be plunked down on the table at home in front of his astonished and delighted family. Those had been wonderful times, and they had never returned, at least not with the same glory. Although later on, Gregor earned enough money to meet the expenses of the entire family and actually did so. They had gotten used to it, the family as well as Gregor. The money was received with thanks and given with pleasure, but no special feeling of warmth went with it anymore. So everybody had been thrilled back then that he was making enough money to cover their expenses. He did it happily and they were grateful, but they'd gotten into their routine, started taking it for granted and taking Gregor for granted. And it was just kind of the way things were now. Everybody was settled into this easy life, easy for everybody but Gregor, who hates his job. Other thing that I want to mention here before I go on is it talks about how he had risen quickly through the company. That same thing happened to Franz Kafka also. Franz Kafka started out studying chemistry at university, but that lasted, I think, what I read was 2 weeks before he switched to law. And a lot of the reason he changed to law or at least something that made his father very happy about that, was that his father believed that it would provide him many more career opportunities in the future than studying chemistry would. So he studied law. After he graduated, he was employed, I think, within a couple of weeks, but he only stayed at that place for a couple of weeks because he hated it, because his, I guess you could say, obsession, his priority, his passion, what he really wanted to do was right. And the hours at the first place he worked did not allow him to do that. So he found a job at another place. It was a insurance company, and he did very well there. He rose through the ranks very quickly. And he really liked that job because he was usually off by 2:00 in the afternoon, which meant he could go home and write. So although he wasn't crazy about the job, he loved the hours because it let him do what he did really love. So that's another similarity between Kafka's life and some of the Metamorphosis. In the story, the father's first reaction on that morning that the family wakes up and Gregor is locked in his room and won't come out, but they're fairly certain something is wrong. That first morning, his father's first reaction is to knock on the door to try to get him to come out. And Kafka describes his knock. He says he knocks, quote, feebly but with his fist on Gregor's door and asks him what's going on. And then it says, then in a, quote, deeper warning voice, unquote, he calls Gregor's name a couple of times. And then when Gregor, what's the word I'm looking for? When Gregor tells him that he is up, he's getting ready, he's going to go to work, his dad is satisfied, and he walks away from the door. Once Gregor opens the door and everybody sees him, his first reaction is, I feel like it's a little bit of pain, it's a little bit of anger. Here's what it says. It's on page 14 of my book. With a hostile expression, his father clenched his fist as if to drive Gregor back into his room, then looked uncertainly around the living room, shielded his eyes with his hands, and sobbed with heaves of his powerful chest. So he has a hostile expression. He's clenching his fist, like he's going to force Gregor to go back into his room. So it's like he's angry, but then he covers his eyes when he's sure nobody's watching, and he cries. So I think he's got a combination of emotions going on there. Then a little later, his anger comes out more. The manager shows up to try to get him to come into work. The father takes the manager's cane and he starts chasing, going after Gregor to get him to go back into his room. And it says that while he's doing that, he's, quote, hissing like a wild man. So at one point in the story, Gregor starts thinking about how things used to be and how they've become. It's later on in the story. And in that, he describes his father as his habit, because he doesn't work, is to, after breakfast, basically hang out at the breakfast table for a long time, reading his newspaper, like for hours. He would just sit at the table and read the newspaper. At the end of chapter 1, which is the scene with his father chasing him and trying to get him back into his room, there, at the end, he finally does succeed. And this is the way that Kafka describes that process. The end of chapter 1 reads like this. From behind, his father gave him a hard shove, which was truly his salvation, Gregor's salvation. And bleeding profusely, he flew far into his room. The door was slammed shut with the cane, the manager's cane that his father had taken. Then at last, everything was quiet. So his dad chases him into his room, slams the door shut, and for the first time in a while, things are quiet. Nobody's freaking out about the way he looks. Nobody's, frantic, hysterical. Everything's finally quiet, in his words. The following day, something important happens that is also a sign of another thing that I see a lot in this story. His father sits down with his mother and sister, Greta, and explains to them their financial situation. So Gregor has been under the impression all these years that his family had no money and that his income saved them from financial ruin, basically. But that doesn't turn out to be the whole truth. Page 25, starting on page 25 of my book, it describes what Gregor overheard his father explaining to Greta and his mother. From time to time, he, the father, got up from the table to get some kind of receipt or notebook out of the little strongbox he had rescued from the collapse of his business 5 years before. So at this point, Gregor's been working at this job that he despises for 5 years. Gregor heard him open the complicated lock and secure it again after taking out what he had been looking for. These explanations by his father were to some extent the first pleasant news Gregor had heard since his imprisonment. He had always believed that his father had not been able to save a penny from the business. At least his father had never told him anything to the contrary. And Gregor, for his part, had never asked him any questions. In those days, Gregor's sole concern had been to do everything in his power to make the family forget as quickly as possible the business disaster which had plunged everyone into a state of total despair. And so he had begun to work with special ardor and had risen almost overnight from stock clerk to traveling salesman. And then there's the part that we read a minute ago about them getting used to it. Okay, and then further down on page 26, it starts with, Gregor now learned in a thorough way, for his father was in the habit of often repeating himself in his explanations, partly because he himself had not dealt with these matters for a long time, partly too because his mother did not understand everything the first time around, that in spite of all their misfortunes, a bit of capital, a very little bit certainly, was still intact from the old days, which in the meantime had increased a little through the untouched interest. So he had been under the impression his family would be destitute if he had not been working, but that wasn't true. But besides that, the money Gregor had brought home every month, he had kept only a few dollars for himself, had never been completely used up, and had accumulated into a tidy principal. Behind his door, Gregor nodded emphatically, delighted at this unexpected foresight and thrift. Of course, he actually could have paid off more of his father's debt to the boss with this extra money. And the day on which he could have gotten rid of his job would have been much closer, but now things were undoubtedly better the way his father had arranged them. Now, this money was by no means enough to let the family live off the interest. The principal was perhaps enough to support the family for a year, or at the most 2, But that was all there was. So it was really just a sum that should not be touched, and that had to be put away for a rainy day. But the money to live on would have to be earned. So, a couple of things here. There was enough money for them to at least have helped pay off the debt so that Gregor could get out of this job that he disliked so much but felt trapped in because the debt was to his manager. And they weren't in such dire straits as Gregor had been allowed to believe. The other thing here, though, is I guess there's two really. One is that throughout this story, Gregor has such a misperception of what's going on. At this point, he's grateful to hear that his family has this money and doesn't even think about the fact that he wouldn't have had to stay. I mean, he acknowledges that the debt could have been paid off sooner, but that's how he thinks of it. He doesn't, I don't know, it seems to me like something that should have angered him. I mean, his family knew he didn't like his job. They should have done something, if they were able to help him. And at least his father knew that they had the money to at least help, and I allowed Gregor to believe they didn't. So that's one thing. Another thing is, I think there is a lot of manipulation by every character in this story. And this is an example of his father manipulating Gregor by not sharing the truth with him about their financial situation. Gregor never asked, and I mean, I don't know, I don't think that's unusual for a son not to ask his father, do you have the money to do X? I think it's a child who cares about their parents, they're just going to do what they can to help in that situation, right? But his father allows him to continue thinking that when he knew that they had more money than Gregor thought they did. So he manipulated, and he allows him to continue thinking that so he can sit at his breakfast table for hours reading the paper. He becomes very inactive. Gregor describes him on page 27 of my book as being a healthy person in spite of the fact that he had not worked for 5 years. So that's another thing. His father did nothing for 5 years to try to help their financial situation. And Gregor didn't think anything of that. He, if anything, feels pity for his father, but he's a healthy man who chose not to work for 5 years. But Gregor then says he quote, could not be expected to undertake too much, unquote, because he'd gained a lot of weight in those 5 years and he had become sluggish. Which also later in the story, I think, turns out to be another way he's manipulated the family. He's not quite as weak as he's letting people think he is. I do think that he was, I don't know, hurt or ashamed or something in the story. It says that neither his father nor mother could bring themselves to come into his room the first 2 weeks. So, I mean, there's a lot of emotions that his father could be having that would keep him from being able to do that, whether it's hurt or anger or shame or I don't know. But he didn't see him for the first 2 weeks. His father does eventually get a job. working at a company of messengers, I believe, and he gets a uniform. The story talks about the nice shiny buttons on it, this special cap he has to wear, and his father loves his uniform. He doesn't want to take it off, and he rarely does take it off. It talks about times that he even falls asleep in his chair with his uniform on. And on page 36, Kafka describes his uniform as well-groomed and strong-looking. So I guess it gives him a look of power, which maybe is why he doesn't want to take it off. And then it says he refuses to take it off, quote, as if he were always ready for duty and were waiting even here at home for the voice of his superior, which I think is similar to how Gregor felt about his job, except maybe they have a different attitude toward it. So Gregor hates his job. There's one part of the story where he talks about he doesn't even feel right calling in. There's a few reasons for that we'll talk about probably in the next video. But one of the reasons he talks about, there's a, I forget what he calls him, something like an insurance doctor, someone who follows up with people who don't come in because they say they're sick. And Gregor is sure that if he were to come to the house, that he would do like he always does, which is decide that he wasn't really sick and he should come in. Of course, this is before everybody sees him, but he feels very used by his company. And so I think the implication here is that his father is at the beck and call of his employer at all times. But you get the impression in the story that he kind of takes pride in that. And another thing I'll talk about at some point is this idea of people in general becoming alienated. Alienation is a theme through this story, and that Kafka sees the kind of work that people were starting to do at that time. So the office work, he worked for insurance companies, pushing papers and so forth. And he felt like that really disengaged people from themselves and from each other and from their life and their true selves. And I think that's one thing that he possibly is saying about his father, that he is prepared at all times to go into work, which would mean leaving his family whenever, but he's fine with that because he's important to the company. So that's something I'll explore more later too. It also says that his uniform became dirty and stained, but he didn't care. He kept it on. But he keeps the buttons polished and shiny, it says. Okay, and I want to read you another passage here. So we'll talk more about a big scene that happens in a future video where Greta and her mother go into Gregor's room while the father is at work, and Greta intentionally waited till her father was at work. It says something like she dared not do it while he was home. So she's afraid of him, or she knows she's doing something he won't like. And they are going to move some furniture out of Gregor's room. So they're going to move everything out of Gregor's room so he has room to climb up the walls, get on the ceiling. Greta knows that he likes to do that. She has seen the sticky stuff that he leaves behind wherever he walks. She has seen it go up the walls and up to the ceiling. And so she knows he likes to do that. And so She says that she wants to move the furniture out so he has room to do that more easily. His father is very upset about this when he gets home. And it says, okay, here's how it starts. "Ah," he cried as he entered, in a tone that sounded as if he were at once furious and glad. And I stopped there when I read it to think about, why is he glad? Is he glad because this gives him the opportunity to show his anger towards Gregor? Is he glad because he gets to show power in front of Greta and the mother? I don't know. Then it continues. He, being Gregor, he had not really imagined his father looking like this as he stood in front of him now. Admittedly, Gregor had been too absorbed recently in his newfangled crawling to bother as much as before about events in the rest of the house, and he really should have been prepared to find some changes. And yet, was this still his father? Was this the same man who in the old days used to lie wearily buried in bed when Gregor left on a business trip? Who greeted him on his return in the evening sitting in his bathrobe in the armchair? Who actually had difficulty getting to his feet, but as a sign of joy only lifted his arms? And who, on the rare occasions when the whole family went for a walk, on a few Sundays in June and on major holidays, used to shuffle along with great effort between Gregor and his mother, who were slow walkers themselves, always a little more slowly than they, wrapped in his overcoat, always carefully planting down his crutch-handled cane, and when he wanted to say something, nearly always stood still and assembled his escort around him. Now, however, he was holding himself very erect, dressed in a tight-fitting blue uniform with gold buttons, the kind worn by messengers at banking concerns. Above the high, stiff collar of the jacket, his heavy chin protruded. Under his bushy eyebrows, his black eyes darted bright, piercing glances. His usually rumpled white hair was combed flat, with a scrupulously exact, gleaming part. He threw his cap, which was adorned with a gold monogram, probably that of the bank, in an arc across the room onto the couch, and with the tails of his long uniform jacket slapped back, his hands in his pants pockets, he went for Gregor with a sullen look on his face. He probably did not know himself what he had in mind. Still, he lifted his feet unusually high off the floor, and Gregor staggered at the giant size of the soles of his boots. But he did not linger over this, the size of his boots, that is. He had known right from the first day of his new life that his father considered only the strictest treatment called for in dealing with him. And so he ran ahead of his father, stopped when his father stood still, and scooted ahead again when his father made even the slightest movement. And this is the beginning of that scene with the apples, where his father throws apple after apple at him to chase him into his room. One lodges itself in Gregor's side, and it eventually starts to get infected. This is page 1 of chapter 3, and it explains, it's about the next morning, basically. Or it's about what happens after the whole apple scene. Gregor's serious wound, from which he suffered for over a month, the apple remained embedded in his flesh as a visible souvenir since no one dared to remove it, seemed to have reminded even his father. Now, the beginning of this started to sort of feel a little sympathy for the guy, but it doesn't turn out so great. Seemed to have reminded even his father that Gregor was a member of the family, in spite of his present pathetic and repulsive shape, who could not be treated as an enemy. Sounds pretty good so far, right? That on the contrary, it was the commandment of family duty to swallow their disgust and endure him. Endure him and nothing more. So, out of duty, not out of love, not out of empathy or sympathy, out of duty, he decides it's only proper that we should endure him. We shouldn't hate him. We should endure him, but we don't have to do anything else. We don't have to love him. We don't have to care about him, but we need to endure him. Okay, and then one more passage to show you the transformation of the father, who used to spend hours at the breakfast table reading his paper and used to seem so weak and so slow on their walks. And let's see. So he fell asleep in the chair in this scene. He has fallen asleep in the chair with his uniform on. And it says, as soon as the clock struck 10, his mother tried to awaken his father with soft, encouraging words, and then persuade him to go to bed, for this was no place to sleep properly. And his father badly needed his sleep since he had to be at work at 6 o'clock. But with the obstinacy that had possessed him ever since he had become a messenger, he always insisted on staying at the table a little longer, although he invariably fell asleep, and then could be persuaded only with the greatest effort to exchange his armchair for bed. However much mother and sister might pounce on him with little admonitions, they're always very gentle, very soft-spoken with him. However much mother and sister might pounce on him with little admonitions, he would slowly shake his head for a quarter of an hour at a time, keeping his eyes closed, and would not get up. Gregor's mother plucked him by the sleeves, whispered blandishments into his ear. His sister dropped her homework in order to help her mother, but all of this was no use. He only sank deeper into his armchair. Not until the women lifted him up under his arms did he open his eyes, looking alternately at mother and sister, and usually say, quote, "What a life. So this is the peace of my old age." And leaning on the two women, although he's perfectly capable of standing erect, he would laboriously, as if he were the greatest weight on himself, and let the women lead him to the door, where, shrugging them off, he would proceed independently, while Gregor's mother threw down her sewing and his sister her pen as quickly as possible, so as to run after his father and be of assistance. I mean, this is a manipulator. And I don't think he's the only manipulator in this story, but that's the only one I'm going to cover for now. Every person in this story manipulates everybody else, with the possible exception of Gregor. But there's a whole lot of other things going on with Gregor. So we will stop there for now. My goals for next time that I see you, which hopefully will be in a week, but I'm going to say a week to 10 days. One is continue with these. I would love to actually get one of my articles finished, but we'll see if that happens. Something else that my father actually mentioned that I think is an excellent idea, and I think I will work on too, I don't know if I'll do it this week, is to work on a study guide. And I'll put that on my website too when I get that together. So I will continue reading and writing about Franz Kafka and the Metamorphosis. I will write something about what I learned in Jesus and the Jewish Roots of Mary. And the next thing I want to read is I want to continue reading the Father Brown stories. I read a little bit of one this past week called The Wrong Shape. And I read that one. I chose that one because I also watched a Father Brown episode that night, and it was The Wrong Shape. And I wanted to compare the two. So far, they are extremely different. So far, I have the impression that the only similarity between the Father Brown on the show and in the books is that they're both Catholic priests who solve murder mysteries. But maybe I'll discover different. Again, I hopefully will be back in a week, but I'm going to say, to play it safe, it'll be a week to 10 days. And at that time, I'll give you another update on my progress on these goals and probably talk about some other topic related to the metamorphosis. I think what I'm planning to do next time is talk about the metamorphosis of Greta and or her mother. That's it for now. I will see you again in a week to 10 days. And thanks for watching and happy reading. Bye-bye.